Welcome back one and all to this mini-series on the historiography of Western esotericism, or, as I said last time, the history of Western esotericism. Basically, I've put this talk together as a means for myself to sort out some of the dialogues going on within academia in regards to Western esotericism. Lots of people complain that academics are off speculating in their ivory towers, never bringing anything to the public and getting caught up in their own fancies. Well, the fact is, their books are just as accessible as anyone else's, despite being on the pricier side. But you're definitely going to get more bang for your buck. In any case, the problem isn't getting to the books. The problem is getting to the journal articles, which are generally behind a paywall. Well, I don't want anyone who actually cares to feel left out. I think if academics make their work too inaccessible, then they can't complain when non-academics don't know what the hell they're rambling on about. So here I am, trying to do justice to the debates in the scholarly literature. Now, before jumping in, I will give a very brief overview of the field because it's relatively new, and if you want to get your toes wet, you'll need a few names. I'm going to draw most of this information from Chiara Ombretta Tomasi's article, some reflections on antique and late antique esotericism. The history of Western esotericism is a relatively new field within the academy. It can be traced back to Dame Frances Yates, who, if I'm not mistaken, worked from the Warburg Institute, and François Secret, who was the first to hold the chair of Christian esotericism at l'École pratique des hautes études in 1964. Furthermore, there was Eugenio Garin and Enrico Castelli, who were chiefly Renaissance scholars, looking at the interaction of pagan culture with Christian society. The problem is that they conceived of the influence from antiquity as a kind of long, golden, unbroken chain. Now, studying esotericism in Italy during the 1960s was difficult because neither the Italian Communist Party nor the Catholic Church wanted anything to do with this superstitious scholarship, and they exerted a very deep influence over the academy. Now, I think it's obvious why the Catholic Church is not interested, what with esotericism being a foothold of Satan and all, but with the Communist Party, the disdain stemmed from their materialist biases. What good could come from a collection of such irrational ideas as magic, alchemy, or astrology? Now, the 1960s weren't that long ago, and some of these prejudices remain since, after all, materialism is still the standard worldview of the academician. Now, in the 80s, this started to change. We start seeing a new crop of scholars emerging. One of these being Wouter Hanegraaff, the current appointee of the history of Hermetic philosophy and related currents in Amsterdam. Other big names in the field are Antoine Favre and Koku von Stuckrad. I think the 1960s, the New Age, LSD, and postmodernism, all of these serve to soften everyone's hearts in regards to studying such ostensibly nonsensical material. And, of course, this is a good thing, not a bad thing. Now, here we start seeing a real acceleration in the quantity of quality publications. But one idea starts to emerge, and that is that, etymology aside, esotericism is to be understood as a body of rejected knowledge. Obviously, the more traditional quote-unquote otherness also comes to mind. Esotericism is a kind of significant other of post-Enlightenment identities. Now, this differed from the way that Antoine Faivre had done things, which was more so to circumscribe esotericism with fixed characteristics or correspondences. So, I quote, 1, the presence of symbolic or real correspondences between things in the universe, such as the idea of a macro and a microcosm, or the doctrine of astral influences. 2, living nature, id est envisioning nature as endowed with its own life force, which is declined in a plural or complex form. 3, imagination, that is in the form of tools that provides access to superhuman realms by means of ritual, symbolic images, mandalas, intermediary spirits, and so forth. And then 4, transmutation, that is the spiritual experience of transformation typical of the attainment of gnosis. And then to these he added 2 more secondary characteristics, concordance, that is a root from which all world religions and spiritual practices stem, and transmission, the idea that esoteric disciplines can be taught by a master to a disciple. Now, the problem here is that what happens when the particular strand of occult gobbledygook that you're reading doesn't fit into all of these categories? Does that mean that it doesn't fit the mold of Western esotericism? How useful are these circumscriptions if they are not universal to all disparate branches of esotericism? Naturally, something had to be done to make Western esotericism more flexible of a label, not just to a bunch of disparate strands held together by virtue of a scholar who likes lumping more than splitting. Alright, well, with that out of the way, the first article I want to examine is called The Problems of Rejected Knowledge. Thoughts on Wouter Hanegraaff's Esotericism and the Academy by Marco Passi. Passi opens up his discussion by first summarizing the thesis of Wouter Hanegraaff's Esotericism and the Academy. And here's what he says, quote, "The concept of Western esotericism has its roots in the ancient wisdom narrative that takes shape in the intellectual cauldron of late antiquity, and which is revived in the Renaissance through authors such as Marsilio Ficino and Giovanni Pico della Mirandola. Later, this ancient wisdom narrative mutates into a negative model, starting especially from the 17th century, when it is adopted by Protestant theologians who use it in the framework of their anti-apologetic agenda. This model, with all due adjustments then, becomes a tool to conceptualize what these authors perceived as the infiltration, throughout the centuries, of pagan beliefs and ideas into the original purity of the Christian message. Slightly after, from the late 17th century on, an alternative theological model of conceptualization of these various heterodox currents as a single phenomenon emerges. In this case, perceived again in a positive light. This model is not based on the ancient wisdom narrative, but rather is influenced by pietism and is grounded in the centrality of direct, unmediated personal experience of the divine. Now, this model is also soon opposed by a negative one, which is the by now increasingly secular model of the Enlightenment, based on the idea that these phenomena, corresponding to what we now call Western esotericism, are none other than the manifestations of superstition and human folly. According to Hanegraaff, all these models had a long fortune in the history of Western culture and are essential to understanding the origins of the concept of Western esotericism, its historical development, and the ideological interests it has served. Hanegraaff claims, in fact, that these models, far from disappearing completely in the sands of history, are at the origin of some basic approaches to not only the study of esotericism, but even more generally to the study of religion, which have been prominent in the landscape of 20th century scholarly research. In other words, Hanegraaff sees the model based on personal experience of the divine as the distant progenitor of the so-called religionist approach. Whereas the Enlightenment approach, based on ridiculing superstition, would be, although I do not see this stated explicitly in the book, at the origins of a reductionist approach. Predictably, for those who are familiar with his previous works, Hanegraaff makes it clear that both these approaches are problematic because they are based on positions that are ideological rather than empirical and essentially non-historical. End quote. Again, that was Marco Passi. Alright, so now we're on some firmer footing in regards to what we're actually talking about, which is the grand narrative of Western esotericism as explained to us by Wouter Hanegraaff. Now, the problem that Marco Passi has with this approach is that, like many recent books that cover themes which are close to Western esotericism, like, say, Gnosticism or magic, it shifts the focus away from the object of study in and of itself, which tends to be softened in order to eliminate all risks of quote-unquote essentialism, and it moves towards a historiographical analysis of how this object has been traditionally conceptualized, how it's been constructed and therefore essentialized. So, in other words, what Passi is saying is that Hanegraaff sets up an umbrella term that doesn't actually exist as a concrete thing in history. Then he starts putting a bunch of historical events or ideas under this umbrella and says, behold, Western esotericism, without giving a definitive criteria of what gets let in and what doesn't. It's kind of like a form of putting the cart before the horse. I myself am guilty of doing this with the Encyclopedia Hermetica, for example, whereby I haven't so much been looking at Hermeticism directly, so much as what I consider to be its constituent parts. This is, in a sense, a historical faux pas. Now, I didn't put the Encyclopedia Hermetica together with the same level of rigor that I would have applied to a scholarly publication. It's more of a primer for people to get their feet wet, so it's not really begging this type of scrutiny. Hanegraaff doesn't get off so easily, however, and that's the name of the game. Publish or perish. Have your work ripped apart by others who are also living by doing the same thing. I should add that I'm pretty sure all or most of these scholars are friends in real life, so if anything seems overly vicious, know that everything is said in good faith. Now, another point Passi raises regards Hanegraaff's use of the term Platonic Orientalism, which we explore in much detail in the last lecture. Passi says this, and I quote, "When discussing the model of the ancient wisdom narrative, Hanegraaff introduces this term and explains that it is useful to indicate the widespread idea, emphasis is mine, in ancient Greek culture that religious wisdom does not have indigenous origins, but had been imported from barbarian, i.e. non-Greek sources. Hanegraaff points out that Platonism understood as ancient divine wisdom derived from the Orient is precisely what characterizes the currents and textual traditions under discussion here, and this fact has long been known to other specialists. The term Platonic Orientalism is therefore used throughout the book to indicate this particular concept, which is not limited to antiquity, but finds a new life with the Renaissance, with figures such as Gemistos Platon, while the underlying notion of ancient wisdom narrative seems to me to be a very important, useful tool. I find the term Platonic Orientalism rather problematic for several reasons. First of all, Hanegraaff is borrowing here a concept that was, in my view, already problematic and confusing in the way that it was defined by John Walbridge, who first proposed it. At the beginning of his book, Wisdom of the Mystic East, where he explains his usage of the term, Walbridge points out that Suhrawardi's project of reviving the wisdom of ancient Iran can be better understood as deriving from a form of Orientalism, which is a more general fascination with ancient wisdom of all kinds. He then adds that this Orientalism is best understood as a perennial Platonic trait. Walbridge cannot, then, avoid referring briefly to Edward Said, whose Orientalism he criticizes on the whole, but from whom he is willing to borrow the idea of a, quote, romantically conceived Orient, made of unchanging, fuzzily conceived, exotic ancient land of wisdom, spices, and fabulous kings. Walbridge, therefore, applies this notion of Orientalism as perennial Platonic trait to Suhrawardi in trying to understand his veneration of the ancient Orient of Hermes, of the ancient Persian sages of legend, and of India. The question that is not asked in the book, and therefore is also never answered, is whether the quote-unquote Orient we're talking about is Suhrawardi's Orient, or rather our own. Does Suhrawardi have any concept of a romantic East of his own, or are we projecting ours onto him? In what sense could the ancient Persian sages be Oriental for an author such as Suhrawardi, who is also a Persian? And in what sense could Egypt be Oriental if, at least geographically speaking, it would actually be a Western land from him? Edward Said's famous Orientalism described a phenomenon which, even if it has its roots in the past, is essentially modern. End quote. Now again, that was Marco Passi. Now, I think it's pretty legitimate criticism, but I can hear Hanegraaff in my head right now saying, I'm not talking about Said's Orientalism. And such are the dangers implicit in using a loaded word. You're going to constantly be swatting people away who are trying to get you to talk about Said. Now, here, I'm going to let Hanegraaff speak for himself. Here's what he says in his article in the same journal, Religion, in response to criticisms against his use of the term Platonic Orientalism. Quote, if I understand them correctly, their objections are ultimately based on the assumption that such a term implies an essentialized category of, quote, the Orient. Such an essentialization of, quote, East versus West is, as they point out, a 19th to 20th century phenomenon, heavily indebted, of course, to evolutionist and colonialist narratives, and therefore leads to anachronistic distortions if projected back onto late antiquity or the Renaissance. With this I fully agree. A projection of essentialism and present-day centered historiography runs like a red thread through my book. But the point is that Platonic Orientalism, as I define it, is not necessarily or inherently related to any belief in an essentializing East-West distinction. For instance, I do not imply that an author such as Numenius saw the, quote, peoples of high renown, the Brahmins, Magi, Egyptians, and Jews, to whom Plato was indebted as parts of one essential unity of Oriental thought, opposed to an equally unified Occident, represented by the mindset of Greece and Rome. This is indeed a modern projection, but I do claim that those ancient nations, which geographically just happened to lie in the East, were all categorized as, quote, barbarian nations by the Greeks because of their languages, and that the strange and unfamiliar custom of these distant peoples lent them a certain aura of mystery that could instill fear or fascination or both. None of this is controversial, as far as I know, but importantly, none of it implies an essentialization of the Orient as a monolithic whole. However, it is indeed true, and perhaps this is what creates the confusion, that the entire ancient wisdom narrative is grounded in a powerful rhetoric of unity and essence. Not necessarily a unity and essence of the Orient as such, but certainly one of divine wisdom and revelation. In sum, that divine wisdom has reached us from some mysterious place in the East does not need to imply that it had to come from the East. I understand and appreciate that the legacy of post-colonialism has caused an extreme sensitivity towards any term that has Orient or Orientalism in it, but I believe we should not allow ourselves to be held hostage forever in our terminological choices by the long shadows of scholars such as Franz Cumonn or Edward Said, or for that matter, by post-colonial discourse. The latter may have tended to claim a monopoly over the term Orientalism, but in fact it is doubtful whether the supposedly universal notions of a reified East versus West was ever so universal even in the 19th century. Therefore, I reserve the right to define Platonic Orientalism in a precise and non-essentialist manner if this helps me better understand what was going on in late antiquity or the Renaissance. End quote. That was Wouter Hanegraaff. Now, one of the reasons I'm letting these guys speak for themselves is that they have a much clearer understanding of what they mean and can elucidate it in as few words as possible without muddying the picture. I don't know about you, but that's about as clear a rebuttal as any. So let's carry on in this fashion, going back and forth between criticisms and answers. Next up, we've got the article, Some Reflections on Wouter Hanegraaff's Esotericism and the Academy by Giovanni Filoramo. Now, one of the chief criticisms levied by Giovanni Filoramo is not all too different from Marco Passi's. It concerns Hanegraaff's use of the label Platonic Orientalism instead of something more traditional like, quote, gnosis. Many of his concerns are addressed in the response I just gave in quoting Hanegraaff, who wrote that response to answer not only Passi's criticisms but also Filoramo's as well. But I should like to at least do him justice and present some of what he said. Quote, in order to highlight the problematic nature of the category of Platonic Orientalism, it suffices to take the example of the way in which the category of Oriental religions and cults, introduced a century ago by Franz Cumonn, has been deconstructed in the last 20 years. This category, back then certainly innovative, derived on the one hand from a reading of the evolutionary history of religions that tended to see in Christianity the culmination of polytheism, and on the other hand from a colonialist vision of the strange and alien East, both fascinating and disturbing. Against this background, the category of Platonic Orientalism raises issues. What exactly was meant by the East at the dawn of the 4th century CE? The operation carried out by authors such as Porphyry and Iamblichus, certainly of paramount importance in the construction of the ancient concept of prisca theologica, intended to merge the most diverse aspects of the countless religious traditions of the empire, regardless of their geographical location. For an author so significant in this tradition as the Emperor Julian, what mattered was the unity of Greek paideia, which he intended to restore in his own way, against the threat posed by a typical Eastern religion such as Christianity. The Christian and pagan authors mentioned by Hanegraaff, from Celsus to Porphyry and Eusebius, are all, in terms of geography and language, Oriental. But what unites them beyond the obvious differences of faith is not this, but rather the transformation of philosophy, already attested to by the middle of the 2nd century and featuring common elements in authors such as Justin and Celsus. From a rational search for truth based on dialogue and confrontation, into a way of life rooted in an ageless, primordial revelation. End quote. Again, that was Filoramo. So this is a serious criticism. Namely, what do modern colonial categories tell us about late antiquity? Hanegraaff admits that this is problematic, but he also reminds us that the ancient wisdom narrative is definitely grounded in a powerful rhetoric of unity and essence, not necessarily a unity and essence of a reified and monolithic East, but the unity and essence of revelation itself. So he posits that the idea that divine wisdom had reached the Greeks from some mysterious place in the East does not need to imply that it actually had to come from the East, but that it came as an idealistic package. Now, I don't know if this qualifies as moving the goalpost, but by and large, he also thinks people are just too sensitive about the word Orientalism. Now, before moving on to some different criticisms, I'd like to quote something Filoramo writes, and I think that this is his closing nod of approval that, despite his criticisms, Hanegraaff does great work. And this is what he says. Without embracing a religionist and essentialist thesis, one can still work with a historicist perspective, being aware of the existence of forms of thought that can pre-exist their historical manifestations without having to assume an ontological or metaphysical foundation. So, in other terms, what Filoramo is saying is that despite all the criticisms he gives, he believes that we actually can, without having to go native and become diehard believers or out-of-control idealists, we can explore different peoples from different periods of history on their own terms while still using guiding principles like Platonic Orientalism or Western Esotericism without having to justify them as concretely real things. And I think Hanegraaff's work is proof of that. Alright, well, moving on. The next article is called, and I love this title, Discourse Theory Trumps Discourse Theory. Wouter Hanegraaff's Esotericism and the Academy by Bernd Christian Otto. This one is particularly interesting because it's quite different from the first two critiques. What this article does is claim that Hanegraaff's problem is that he sees himself as a historian, but in reality, he's just one of those filthy postmodernist Foucault-worshipping discourse theoreticians. Oh, I jest. Now, to Otto, this is not an insult, but to a proud historian, especially one with a distaste for pomo litcrit, it stings. In his own words, Otto writes, quote, that the author is not willing to classify his own approach as such is explained with recourse to his dispute with Koku von Stuckrad, who, according to Hanegraaff, would embody discourse theory, whereas Hanegraaff would embody history. A comparison of Hanegraaff's Esotericism and the Academy, Rejected Knowledge in Western Culture, Cambridge University Press 2012, and von Stuckrad's Locations of Knowledge in Medieval and Early Modern Europe, Esoteric Discourse and Western Identities, Brill 2010, reveals that this is a misleading classification and that Hanegraaff's study comes closer to what discourse theory is all about. And as a consequence, Esotericism and the Academy is the very first study on Western esotericism that offers a convincing justification of this particular label as an overarching discursive category. He continues. Even though Hanegraaff himself appears to be cautious while putting the label to use, he presents overwhelming evidence for the interconnectedness of Western discourses about Plato, Hermes, Pythagoras, Zoroaster, or Orpheus, about the Chaldeans, Templars, Rosicrucians, Illuminati, or Theosophers, about magia naturalis, alchemy, astrology, mesmerism, occultism, or parapsychology from the 15th to the 21st centuries, be they from polemical or religionist perspectives. Hanegraaff's fascinating synopsis of the entire field and all its complexity and diversity yields the conclusion that there is a meta-structure that holds all these seemingly disparate strings together. End quote. Now the problem is that Hanegraaff, ostensibly repping the position of the historian, rejects von Stuckrad's claim that only discourse theory can solve the riddles endemic in the concept of Western esotericism. And here's why, in Hanegraaff's own words. Quote, the problem lies in an exclusivist and reductionist subtext that automatically devalues contents and ideas in favor of structures. This makes history subservient to theory and ends up promoting discursive approaches as the only valid methodology in the study of religion, esoteric or otherwise. In other words, discourse theoreticians force their work through a filter or a mold. They make the sources say what they want them to say, whereas historians are supposed to coax their work out of the sources. They listen to what the sources have to say. Ultimately, I think Otto is invoking that old Nietzschean maxim that if you battle with monsters, you may yourself become one, and if you stare into the abyss of postmodernism, the abyss of postmodernism stares back into you. He says, quote, Hanegraaff portrays discourse theory as a rather destructive tool that stands in the way of true historical research. When applying the method, he claims it's not just the term esotericism that vanishes as a useful concept, but much of the historical material will vanish as well. Finally, Hanegraaff maintains that history trumps theory, as if the two would exclude each other, and that good historians shouldn't allow philosophy to paralyze them. Given these statements, one is not surprised to see Hanegraaff bashing Foucault in various instances. Hanegraaff's monographs systematically implements an observation only alluded to by von Stuckrad, that basic genres of esoteric discourse, such as the disciplines of astrology, alchemy, and magic, etc., have been distanced away by what I call the process of disjunction since the late 18th century, and thereby function as a significant other of post-Enlightenment Western identities. While von Stuckrad lacks a systematic elaboration of this phenomenon in his Locations of Knowledge, Hanegraaff's Esotericism and the Academy not only offers overwhelming evidence for these processes of disjunction, but also falsifies von Stuckrad's claim that they started only in the 18th century. To the contrary, Hanegraaff traces back polemics against the ancient wisdom narrative to the early 1500s, where, for example, the very nephew of Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, Gianfresco Pico della Mirandola, attempted to destroy what his uncle had built by means of his Examen Vanitatis Doctrinae Gentium, and he convincingly unveils the complex discursive interconnectedness between these early polemics against Platonism and various later polemics against offshoots such as Magia Naturalis, alchemy, or the, quote, occult sciences. Okay, and here's the meat of Otto's argument. Taking these observations into account, Hanegraaff's study could indeed be understood as a genuine discourse analysis of power relations in regard to the field of Western esotericism, of the latter's construction as a respective other of both European religions, mostly Christian, and science, and finally of affirmative counter-reactions by people who, at some point, started identifying themselves with these various forms of, quote, rejected knowledge, end quote. So, in other words, buddy, you're a discourse theoretician. Why you gotta be such a hater? As if Hanegraaff would read this and go, oh God, I knew it all along, I'm a deviant. Alright, well, in all seriousness, these are Otto's observations. 1. Hanegraaff uses the word discourse extensively throughout his work, and he's not using it in its everyday understanding of the term, that is, as dialogue. Rather, Hanegraaff is getting real buddy-buddy with Foucault, employing discourse as the sum of all statements, generally in texts for historians, that form, quote, a coherent terminological and argumentative structure, which gives a kind of flavor to any single given statement formulated in that text. It's like a fractal that is self-similar across scales, and yet the whole is ever greater than the sum of its parts. Otto holds that Hanegraaff's Esotericism and the Academy appears as, quote, the very first volume that systematically addresses the overall issue of power ingrained in the discursive field of Western esotericism, thereby outlining its inherent structure and problematics in a much more elaborate way than has been done thus far, especially by taking both polemical and religionist narratives into account. When Hanegraaff writes that history should trump theory, he overlooks that his own narrative is the very outcome of theory, namely, of his systematic adoption and deployment of numerous discourse-theoretical mythologisms. That discourses produce their objects is one of the essential postulations of Foucauldian discourse analysis, and one is stunned by the fact that Hanegraaff uses formulations very similar to Foucault's original phrasing. Hanegraaff's interpretation of a large number of authors in Esotericism and the Academy indeed shows his de-essentializing, constructivist approach that finally leads to the claim that Western esotericism is an imaginative construct in the minds of intellectuals and the wider public, not a straightforward historical reality that is, quote-unquote, out there. Otto continues. Apparently, Hanegraaff's analysis of discourse about rejected knowledge begins with the early modern reception, George Gemistos Pletho, Marsilio Ficino, Pico della Mirandola, and others, of various ancient, mostly Platonic and Neoplatonic, but also Kabbalistic, textual corpora. Thus, the discursive category of Western esotericism arises, according to Hanegraaff, by means of counter-reactions to these ancient wisdom narratives, and thereby seems to constitute a genuine, if not unique, aspect of early modern and modern European history. End quote. And again, that was Bernd Christian Otto. Now, this is beautiful criticism, but I must say that Hanegraaff just looked at all this and said, okay, then I am a historian who uses discourse theory as one of the many tools in my toolkit. And since, like Otto said himself, the two need not be mutually exclusive categories, that is, historian and discourse theoretician, then one can and should ideally be both, with the reiteration of the caveat that history trumps discourse, a statement which obviously Foucault would have rejected. Okay, moving on. We've got our last critique, and this one is my favorite. I should say from the outset, I had a good laugh when I first read this article, because I didn't look at who wrote it before I read it, and as I was flipping through the pages, I kept thinking to myself that, man, it's easy to think with a hammer, in the sense that it's always easier to tear down than it is to build up. And lo and behold, I checked the name of the author, and his name is Olav Hammer. So there you have a little fun synchronicity I experienced. Now let's get into what Hammer actually says. So the name of this article is Deconstructing Western Esotericism on Wouter Hanegraaff's Esotericism and the Academy. This introduction is brilliant, but I think it has issues which I'll outline later, so this is a direct quote. Esotericism and the Academy reminds me strikingly of a book I once read, and the title of which, at a distance of more than 30 years now, escapes me, dealing with a very different topic. An anthropological study of business management. Top-level executives of various firms typically made ad hoc decisions prompted by the day-to-day activities of their companies. When asked, in retrospect, how they had built up their organization, this rather haphazard meandering was curiously transformed into the story of long-term visions implemented by means of deliberate management strategies. The development of a field of Western esotericism in Hanegraaff's narrative is similar. A very diverse set of practices, defended or rejected for very different reasons by very different groups of people at very different times, ends up constituting a diffuse something with few, if any, internal characteristics that serve to define it. With the exception of some hints at the end of the book, little seems to unite, say, alchemy, the quest for a hidden macro-history, and astrology, except that some powerful and trend-setting individuals at various points in time declared that they were vehemently opposed to all these pursuits. Historical contingency reigns supreme. So, I continue with Hamer. Divergence and semi-arbitrary demarcations are the consequences of seeing esotericism as an umbrella concept that slowly emerges when a mass of events are looked at in hindsight. Just like the managers who performed their daily tasks in a rather ad hoc manner, but saw the outcomes as a predictable result of a managerial strategy, esotericism is the end result of countless individuals involving themselves in polemics over a number of wildly diverging topics, and later generations seeing the results than was warranted by the material. End quote. Alright, so this is a brilliant analogy, and I just love how mundane it is too. Now, my problem with it is this. Firstly, can things not be determined apophatically? Can we not come to know what a thing is by carving away at what it is not? That's how we found the Higgs boson. I think, after all, this is ultimately what Hanegraaff is saying when he refers to Western esotericism as a wastebasket of ideas. But my main problem with Hamer's ideas here are that you can literally apply this deconstruction to anything. Rome, Platonism, Scholasticism, chivalry, Islam, whatever. Existence precedes essence. There is nothing but the sum of ad hoc decisions made in real time, which are then reconceptualized in hindsight. So, why bring it up as a criticism? Now, I say Islam because that's quite literally the example he uses as a counterpoint to esotericism. And this is what he says. Quote, "There seems to be practically nothing that unites all expressions of esotericism. Esotericism dissolves into an array of individual, repeatedly changing elements, utterly malleable across time. I would call this a consequence of radical historicism rather than a drawback. This is, nevertheless, a very different way of defining a religious phenomenon, current, or tradition than one usually finds in the scholarly literature on religion. Most commonly, despite various disclaimers suggesting that traditions such as Islam or Buddhism are very flexible and lack easily identifiable core characteristics, some attempt is usually made to nonetheless define and delimit the tradition in question. Such definitional endeavors tend to go in either one of two directions. One approach, the historical, is to identify core historical events that have shaped all or nearly all manifestations of the tradition. For Islam, that could be the prophetic career of Muhammad, the turbulent events that took place after his death and involved the identity and leadership of the community of believers, and the emergence in the brief space of the 9th and 10th centuries of a paradigmatic commentarial, theological, ritual, and legal traditions. Muslims may have widely divergent views on who Muhammad was, but will agree that he was the fulcrum around which salvation history has revolved. I continue with Olav Hamer. The other approach is synchronic. A tradition can, on this view, be defined by identifying substantive elements that are widely shared, even if perhaps not universal, at a given point of time. Again, for Islam, almost all self-professed Muslims have at least a nominal acquaintance with the Quran, and with even a modicum of education, will treat a core set of commentarial, theological, and ritual elements as part of a corpus that needs to be taken into account. Hanegraaff's approach seems to acknowledge that neither method is readily applicable to Western esotericism. Its elements are widely divergent to the point of being mutually contradictory, and arose over the span of Western intellectual history from antiquity to today via a process of historically contingent accretion. Even elements that previous scholarship has attempted to unite are here sundered. The occult, for instance, is in Esotericism and the Academy deconstructed as a pseudo-category. End quote. Now, my problem here with Olav Hammer is that the very deconstruction he's applying to Hanegraaff can be applied to deconstruct his deconstruction. He's saying Hanegraaff has one way of doing history, but that this doesn't match the two modes, the historical and the synchronic, which he recognizes as legitimate. Now, where does this legitimacy emerge from? Tradition? Institutional authority? It seems to be that way to me. What makes his way of doing history superior? I don't know. These modes are not justified, merely prescribed. Why should Hanegraaff, or anyone for that matter, be bound to use these two modes Hammer suggested? I believe that you can press on any definition hard enough to make it break, but you can do it to anything to the point where you risk breaking the usefulness of language altogether, leaving us all lapsing into solipsism. Is a nebula not a real thing just because it is nebulous? Now, let's accept for a moment that these two modes, the historical and the synchronic modes, are indeed superior. Couldn't we just find one of these events or elements and hinge esotericism off of that? Hammer gives us the following lists and pretends as if there isn't a glaring commonality between all of these things. Here's the list he gives us. The Swedenborgian Church, Spiritualism, Jungian Spirituality, the Theosophical Society, the Anthroposophical Society, Gurdjieffian-inspired groups, the Church Universal and Triumphant, Wicca, and a host of other similar neo-pagan currents, the New Age, several Rosicrucian orders, the Human Potential Movement, occultist magic, various New Thought denominations, Satanism, several UFO religions, and traditionalism with a capital T. Hammer claims all these are movements that do not share even a single ritual or doctrine, and that they all function in sociologically very diverse ways. Well, frankly, I disagree, because to me it's perfectly clear that all these groups are unified more loosely by the bracket of idealists, but more narrowly by the shared element of gnosis or personal revelation. They may all have different content within their revelations, but the point is that they all believe in the primacy of first-hand experience when it comes to the divine. Higher wisdom is super-rational and not universally or even popularly apprehended. Just because Hammer chooses not to see this element doesn't mean it's not there. So, again, I ask, what makes Hanegraaff's work on esotericism any different than a work on, say, quote, Greek philosophy or, quote, Islam, for that matter? Who sets the criteria on how tight or concrete these subjects of inquiry need to be before engaging in them? Because if it's self-evident, it isn't evident to me by the same logic that is used to deconstruct esotericism. So this is a gripe that I have with deconstructing things. When does it stop, and why? Hammer accuses Hanegraaff of circumscribing, not defining. And I wonder if there's actually a difference when it comes to concepts. Could Hammer define Islam for me? Or would he circumscribe it? Sure, we can define a triangle, but can we define a collection of ideas? Hamer says himself in defining the two quote-unquote proper modes of historical inquiry, traditional scholars attempt to, quote, define and delimit these. But can Islam really be pinned down to a pithy definition? Or rather, can it only be delimited? By the way, I would like to point out that delimit and circumscribe effectively mean the exact same thing here. Albeit circumscribe is being loaded with a pejorative sense and used as a reproach to Hanegraaff, whereas delimit is being used with a positive sense. So, in the end, I question the usefulness of deconstructing esotericism if you're going to give Islam as your example of something scholars have pinned down concretely. I would love to sit down with Hamer and hash out just exactly who is and who is not a Muslim. We'd find it quite hard to come to any agreement, but in the end, would we walk away from one another saying that Islam must not be a real thing? Just like Muslims, I think esotericists would agree on certain points. By and large, they would recognize one another as heterodox mystics of one strain or another, each of whom are in dialogue with a hidden knowledge or ancient wisdom, whether it be traditional in actuality or merely idiosyncratic. I don't think that's so nebulous as to be non-existent. I think another one of my problems is that in these discussions, esotericism is being likened to a religion onto itself and then criticized on those terms. It's not a religion. It's a pursuit of interiority which can operate within any given religion, such as Christian Kabbalah or Islamic Batanism. Esotericism must be understood by what it is not. And it is not the communal, external dimensions of religion, aesthetics, architecture, ritual, community binding, festivals, etc. The reason most Buddhists don't have much in common with Buddhist monks is because they aren't dedicated to the esoteric dimensions of Buddhism like the monks are. They're monks by virtue of their esoteric, that is part of an inner circle, interests. In any case, these are my concerns, and they may or may not be misguided, and I'm sure Hamer would have some answers, but these would probably only beg more questions ad absurdum, and such is the nature of the game. But in any case, Hanegraaff's concerns are different. Before switching back to his final words on the debate, I'll give one last quotation by Hamer because I think it's bang on, and I think it serves as a warning to us all. Quote, "One reason why the atomism of radical historicism has gained such a strong foothold in academia more generally is that comparativism was wielded with indiscriminate gusto by writers such as Mircea Eliade, a man specializing in no particular tradition but willing to draw parallels between all and any, or various post-Freudians, Jung and Campbell, who assumed that Procrustean readings could reduce myths from all around the world to a small set of universal themes. Though it would carry too far and demand too much space to defend universalizing theories, it is a readily observable fact that there is, in the study of religions, once again, an increasing readiness to accept wide-ranging comparative theories." End quote. All right, well, let's wrap this up and move on to the final article. The Power of Ideas, Esotericism, Historicism, and the Limits of Discourse by Wouter J. Hanegraaff. This is his response article. Hanegraaff starts out by setting up a dichotomy between his critics, between the quote-unquote pure historicism approach of Giovanni Filoramo on the one side of the spectrum, and on the other side, Olav Hamer as the quote-unquote theory guy, for whom theory trumps history, not vice versa. Hanegraaff claims it's impossible for him to make a choice for either of these two alternatives, and this is why. Quote, "The reason is that, in my way of doing intellectual history, I'm essentially a Kantian. I believe that ideas are empty unless they appear in concrete, empirical, and historical realities, and blind unless we pursue their structural logic. Within the dialectics of that constellation, no theory without empiricism, no empiricism without theory, my work is source-driven rather than theory-driven. Everything, for me, begins with studying empirical source materials in as much detail as possible. However, my very understanding of empiricism is informed by the quintessentially Kantian insistence, prominent also in Max Weber, on the active role of the knowing subject. There can be no doubt, of course, that theoretical reflections come into play already before selecting and interpreting sources, or is implicit in that very activity." End quote. Then he continues later on. Quote, "Stripped to its very core, my book tries to tell the story of how Christian intellectuals and their post-Enlightenment heirs have been trying to deal with a problem that could not be resolved and refused to go away. In its original form, this problem was the presence of pagan, Hellenistic speculation in an intellectual culture nominally grounded in biblical revelation. It constituted a problem because paganism could not be wholeheartedly embraced and accepted, since it stood for the very thing that both Jews and Christians were supposed to reject, but could not be gotten rid of either, because it happened to be integral to the very theological fabric on which Christians relied to explain what they and their religion were all about. I am arguing that the never-ending, because the ultimately hopeless, project of resolving this dilemma, to call it diabolical would be an obvious pun in this context, constitutes one of the most fundamental, quote, deep structures of Western intellectual history. Not only is it crucial to the constitution of Christian identities since the Church Fathers, or the confessional battles unleashed by the Reformation in its battle with the Church of Rome, but through the mediation of 17th century Protestant polemicists, the so-called anti-apologists. Even the rhetorical construction and establishment of Enlightenment identities and the closely related project of disenchanting the world through science and rationality are still variations on the same theme. In other words, my book is ultimately about the longue durée of a fundamental problem, or precisely of attempts to respond to it, that has haunted Western culture from the first centuries to the present. End quote. Now, here Hanegraaff goes on a little digression, which I find very endearing because it seems I experienced the same story. He tells us how he got interested into this quote-unquote forgotten continent of thought in Western culture, which nobody around him ever took seriously. His initial curiosity began with the New Age bookshops popping up everywhere throughout the 70s and the 80s. When he came to realize that nobody, and this is an exaggeration of his part, had taken the trouble to actually read and analyze the texts at the source of the New Age. In my opinion, to say nobody read Donnelly, Blavatsky, Aleister Crowley, Manly P. Hall, etc. is just patently wrong. Obviously, the New Age had to start somewhere, and it just wasn't on TV. But let's move on. What I'll give Hanegraaff is this. People definitely had not been trying to put them within any kind of historical context. He says that during that time, the New Age was seen as something for outsiders, or the media to poke fun at, but not as a form of popular religion that should be taken seriously in any way. And here's where Hanegraaff's story is similar to mine. he simply couldn't understand why this was the case. It was not that he was in any way impressed by New Age ideas. It was more so that he'd found the theological underpinnings of his own Protestant upbringing at least as bizarre. He writes, quote, "I had been told that God has fathered a son, without a mother in sight, but with the help of a virgin, who then proceeded to save humanity by dying on a cross and rising up to heaven. None of that made any sense to me. Why, I asked myself, would such a wildly improbable story be considered more serious and respectable than other admittedly far-out ideas involving such things as reincarnation, channeled entities, or ascended masters? All of it was pretty strange, to be quite honest. I saw the taken-for-granted distinctions between serious and non-serious religion as simple prejudice, and I still do. Now, these early conclusions of mine could have made me into a skeptic debunker, but instead they turned me into a scholar of religion. I might not share these beliefs, but I have never, well, almost never, felt an impulse to ridicule them or dismiss them as nonsense, perhaps because the question of their ultimate truth did not strike me as particularly interesting. Rather, they fascinated me as creative products of the religious imagination, and I genuinely wanted to understand why people would come to hold such interesting beliefs." End quote. Now, it's for this reason that I even started the Encyclopedia Hermetica myself, and doubtless Hanegraaff started out on his journey to get a finger on the history of the New Age. And let's just say, the New Age was merely the very tip of an extremely deep iceberg. What he ultimately found while scratching away at the New Age was that it was but the latest effervescence bubbling out from Western esotericism's long history. Now, different scholars had different perspectives when approaching the topic, along the spectrum from strongly realist to strongly nominalist approaches. The realists suggested that Western esotericism was actually a real historical tradition that actually existed out there in consensus reality, just waiting for us to discover and study it. The nominalist position, on the other hand, rejects all universals in favor of particulars. In other words, Western esotericism is just a theoretical construct in the mind of scholars, and we're merely ordering the world by naming it, even though our signifiers have no intrinsic connection to the things they signify. Now, trying to get himself out of these two extremes, in good Hermetic fashion, Hanegraaff's strategy has been to go to the source and let them speak for themselves, rather than forcing them to say what he wants them to say through the lens of theory. In writing about Western esotericism, he was really trying to write a history of how scholars and intellectuals have imagined it and why. And of course, we're all very happy that he did so. All right. That's as far as I'm willing to go. Thanks for joining me. I hope that this has been somewhat useful to you in your studies of Hermeticism, esotericism, the occult, or whatever. I would encourage you to look at the bibliography in the notes, and if you can, do some of the reading yourself, because naturally I can't reproduce all the arguments here, and many of them are quite sophisticated, so I didn't want to run the risk of compressing them to the point of ironing out the complexities and creating straw men. Now, for those of you thirsty for more Hanegraaff, I think some of you who hang out around here would get a real kick out of his talk here on YouTube entitled Entheogenic Esotericism, where he goes into some detail about the unsung historical impact of Terence McKenna. It's a gem, I promise. And if for some reason you happen to be Wouter Hanegraaff and you're listening to this, please don't hesitate to contact me, as I would love to have a chat with you, particularly in regards to hashing out how the Picatrix fits into the story of Platonic Orientalism. If you ever want to come on and have a chat, I'll leave an open invitation for you. So, good day to one and all, and thank you for listening. I'm Dan Atrell.